Hi, this is Sweet Life, and I'm Natasha, back at it with a review and discussion of The Silence of the Lambs. The Silence of the Lambs is one of my favorite films, if not my favorite. The movie stars Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling, a rookie FBI agent who's called upon to help identify a serial killer known as Buffalo Bill. Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, was a distinguished forensic psychiatrist but is now in prison after murdering and cannibalizing several people. Starling is sent to meet with and question Lecter in hopes that his insights might lead to the capture of Buffalo Bill. But as an incredibly intelligent and manipulative man, Lecter turns these sessions on Starling and probes her mind in exchange for his insights into Bill. I saw it for the first time, I think, maybe in junior high or high school. So it was actually quite some time after it came out. And I believe actually it was like my older cousins that let me watch it, which probably wasn't the best idea or the best judgment, but I'm glad that they did. And I think it's an incredible movie. In general, I'm a fan of Jodie Foster's, right? I like most of her movies. She's one of those actors or actresses where just about anything they appear in, I check out or I'll look into and am willing to watch for the most part. In the case here, this movie I watched, I can't even remember how many times. In recent years, it's become a tradition of mine to watch it on my birthday. You can tell I really enjoy this movie. I remember once being on a job interview, right? And I just felt like this wasn't the right place for me. It kind of had a Mean Girls atmosphere. But I was asked about my favorite movie, and I mentioned this being one of my favorite movies, and the room kind of went silent. But in watching this film, what I like about it is that, number one, you have a strong female lead, which in a lot of movies really isn't the case. Even in action movies or thrillers, you might have a female character or a female lead, but a lot of times they're just there to be eye candy. They don't really do much of anything. But here you have it that Jodie Foster, who's starring as Clarice Starling, she's not an unattractive woman or anything like that, but instead there's a greater focus on her intelligence, on her being tough and capable. She's a fully fleshed out character, which is something that you don't find in a lot of movies, especially in a film like this. Anthony Hopkins does a really great job with, and otherwise would have really dominated the film. I think I read somewhere that despite the movie being about 2 hours or so, and him having a real presence throughout the movie, he really only appears for about 12 minutes on screen. But still, his presence is such that throughout the movie that he manages to hold his own against Clarice Starling, and vice versa. You know, he's the obvious second star of the movie, but doesn't overshadow the character of Clarice Starling. And so I've just found it to be impressive all around. I'm not too into horror movies with monsters and ghosts and things like that, but I like thrillers like this where, for the most part, you have a realistic villain or foe that could potentially exist in the real world. I like psychological thrillers like this. I like true crime, police procedurals, detective work. So this is just the perfect combination of things. For me, a lot of the psychological stuff, especially with Hannibal Lecter, I find that really interesting. I like that spin on it. Not to mention that you have the involvement of the FBI and their behavioral science unit. So it's just the perfect combination of factors for me to like the film. In addition to that, you have really great performances turned in by Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. The story is incredible, and everything comes together to make a really great movie. One of the early scenes in the movie is actually one of, I think, probably the best, which would be Clarice and Hannibal Lecter meeting for the first time. It's the first of several one-on-one sessions between them. But just the way that in a brief few minutes of them meeting, Lecter looks her over, picks her apart, tells her her whole background. I love that kind of stuff. In a way, it reminds me of Sherlock Holmes. So in reading Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stories, Holmes would just walk into a scene and in minutes be able to break down what happened, who was there, tell you about the people, what kind of work they do. I love that kind of stuff, like deduction. And so it's something that I liked about this movie, right? That I like about thrillers where there's greater focus on intelligence, using your mind versus just, bang, bang, shoot 'em up, guns and bombs and that kind of stuff. And so one of the things that I found especially interesting recently about this movie is that you have Clarice Starling, who is early in her career. She's still going through training. When the movie starts, she's at Quantico training to become an agent. She has multiple disadvantages, vulnerabilities really, within this organization. So just in terms of her physical appearance compared to the people around her. like the first scene where she's being called in from the field to meet with Crawford, her supervisor. She steps onto the elevator and it's filled with men, like other recruits and agents. She's substantially shorter than all of them. Like they tower over her. She's a woman, but then she's also relatively short. She's relatively new to the agency. She's a rookie. And it's like, you just have all of these things stacked against her, these potential disadvantages, vulnerabilities. And that combined with the story, like her being an interesting character, it makes for a very compelling story. You root for her. So first off, no good comes from people who drive vans and they don't work for like a church or have some kind of transportation service. On a whole, like just get rid of them. So you look at this guy, Buffalo Bill, and first of all, he has like the arm in the cast thing reminded me of Ted Bundy, right? Like the ruse that he would use to lure women into helping him and then abducting them. Because who would really be out by themselves trying to pick up a couch, especially with a broken arm? And so we see a victim being abducted where if you look inside his van, there's like this weird paneling. You know, in general, I'm not helping a stranger in a situation like this. If it's the two of us out on the street, no one else, I see you by yourself, I'm sorry, but there's no way I'm coming to help you. I'm not getting into your van. I'm not helping you to lift anything. It's just an absolute no-go. I remember actually reading the book, Silence of the Lambs, back when I was in high school for English class. And so we had to read it and like read a book and then compare it to a movie. And so with that, I dug a little bit deeper into the true crime aspect of it, right? Finding out that the story was in some ways influenced by Ted Bundy, but also Ed Gein and some of the other factors that went into the development of the story in the movie. And so I find these kinds of films to be far more terrifying than movies with like monsters, ghosts, or like slasher films. Because though relatively rare, you do have people like this that unfortunately exist in the world. And so it's like, the fact that something like this could happen, I find is more terrifying. Throughout the film, you have this thing of Clarice's gender, right? Her being in these predominantly male environments, first at FBI headquarters, and then later on when they go to West Virginia to, as part of like the investigation into the first body that she's brought in on, they go to what appears to be a funeral home where there's a bunch of state troopers gathered there. And so Crawford, takes aside I think the chief or the sheriff of the troopers or whatever, and like asks him to step aside, like, you know, let's step over to the side to speak, kind of looking over his shoulder at Starling. It's something that she comments on later where, I don't know if underestimation is the proper term, but rather this thing of her gender and whatnot resulting in the people around her being kind of precious about her. This consideration that either she can't handle the job or they need to be delicate and overly considerate about her, which kind of leads to her being frozen out from certain discussions, conversations. And she eventually explains like she's fully capable. We see that she's fully capable. But with that, she needs to have access. She needs to be treated like the other agents and officers are being treated. So with the psychological profiling and all this stuff, like investigating crime scenes and whatnot, I find that absolutely fascinating. But there's also this other entity, right? The first male entities. So you have the FBI and Crawford. The second would be Hannibal Lecter. And then the third is Buffalo Bill. So these three like male entities, right? Much of the film, the two of them don't have interaction, right? Clarice and Buffalo Bill, because she's hunting him down. But there's actually a pretty cool scene, right? One of the things that I like about Silence of the Lambs is that each time I watch, I pick up on like little new touches, right? I notice new things. In previous viewings, I remember noticing that when Clarice figures out who Buffalo Bill is and goes to the house, there are like these photos of moths and things like that. And moths figure prominently throughout the story. But in this viewing, I realized he has this lady down in the bottom of this well thing. And the camera kind of pans up towards the top. And for the first time, at least for myself, that's the first time I noticed like these bloody handprints on the wall where she and possibly some of the previous women had like, you know, tried to get out and ended up injuring themselves in the process. But a question that I do have about Buffalo Bill is he's outside of this girl's apartment when she arrives home from wherever it is that she's coming from. He's standing out there. It's not like, you know, he was out there and he happened to see her coming along, or maybe he was, right? But what are the odds of a person walking by in this area? He's sitting there with night vision goggles on and this girl pops up. I don't understand how this would happen in happenstance. Like, how did he settle upon this particular girl, right, to be waiting outside of her place? Because this doesn't look like the hunting grounds for abducting someone, right? The place is pretty empty and deserted. It's an apartment complex and there are a lot of cars, but it's at night. And so not a lot of people are walking about. How would you settle on this particular area? So Chilton is running the mental hospital where Lecter is being kept, right? He seems to be a bit off himself. Early on in the film, when Clarice goes to first see Hannibal, the two of them have a conversation, right? Hannibal states that in exchange for giving them information about finding Bill, he would like to be transferred to a federal facility, someplace far away from Chilton. And I found it very telling that he specifically stated that he wanted to get away from Chilton. If you look at it, Clarice is trying to advance in her career. And on the other side of it, you have Lecter, where he's trying to get a transfer to another facility. You then have Chilton, who seems to just want attention, like originally attention from the police and then later on public attention. As we see later on in the film, he's standing in the midst of a press conference, really enjoying taking advantage of the opportunity to talk on camera and bring attention to himself, to hopefully make a name for himself. So in the scene where they're gearing up to arrange Hannibal's transfer, Chilton comes in to speak to him, and he has like this questionnaire along with a pen, right? It's an item that he's not supposed to have. And this after lecturing Starling on all the rules for interacting with Lecter. But Chilton is so focused on getting attention for himself that he doesn't realize what a dangerous situation he's creating. And so with that, it leads to another of my favorite scenes in the movie, right? The interactions between the police and Hannibal. So you have like the investigative side of the story where Starling is trying to figure out who Buffalo Bill is, right? And we start trying to figure out who he is. But in the midst of that, she's also dealing with this thing of figuring out herself at the same time. And so one of my favorite scenes is sort of towards the end of the film, right? I certainly enjoyed the scenes between Clarice and Hannibal and like the psychological profiling and whatnot between them. But the later scene where Hannibal is being held during his transfer, and it's like they put him in this cage, right? The scene is gory, but the scene of him escaping is a scene where like you have to pay careful attention. So in the earlier scene where you see him speaking to Chilton, you see that he's so aware of things. He pays attention to things, like this little metal clip on the pen that Chilton hands to him. I know in a lot of situations when you have like truly violent people or patients that might be a danger to themselves or others, it's a rule to be very careful about what items are given to or allowed around them. Like if someone's on suicide watch or something like that. And so you see this pen with just this little clip on it, this little thing for a split second that's passed across the screen. You know, it's a lingering shot that tells you to pay attention to it, right? But on first viewing, you won't realize how important it is. But it's like the film has these little touches that you have to pay attention to sit up and take notice, because it seems like a little thing that's just there for seconds, maybe a minute, if that. But it plays such a major role in the later scene of his escape. And so I like films where you have to pay careful attention. And so you have this thing of like the silencing of the lambs, right? Where Clarice in her early life and her early experiences was living with an uncle on a farm where she wakes up to the slaughtering of lambs, right? Hears them screaming, crying. And as a child, she makes this attempt to run away with one of the lambs to save at least one of them. And this is something that Hannibal Lecter probes and finds out about, gets her to revisit. In speaking to her, he gets her to tell his story. And so she's now joined the FBI as a young woman and is trying to do her part, make a difference. But it kind of goes back to this early childhood experience of her effectively trying to silence these lambs, to comfort them, to save them. And in this case, you have these girls who are being harmed, and she's trying to help solve this case, right, to save them. Essentially, as she was unable to silence the lambs or to save the lambs as she was when she was a child, she's now trying to do it as an adult. So basically, you have these innocent young women who are being killed, and she's now attempting to save them. So with Hannibal, you know, they bring him his dinner tray, and, you know, they put him in handcuffs, but we see him slide the clip from the pen out of his mouth. You don't actually see him, you know, break it off or anything like that. But just this little thing of him sliding it out of his mouth to then holding it between his fingers. And it's like, this doesn't look good. And so the escape scene is violent. It's brutal, but still incredible. And then to add to it, you have this classical music playing in the background. From there on out, it's just, I don't even know how to describe the scene. It's violent, yes, I'll admit to that, but just the flow of action and everything that happens, it's something that you see in very few movies. Just the way that it all comes together, like it goes from being very subtle, or it starts out that way, right, to just this suddenness, the taking off of the handcuffs and everything just going completely left in absolutely no time. Throughout the film, we've heard things about his acts of violence, but he's mostly calm, mild-mannered even. And it's just like a flip of a switch, where even the scene itself goes from this very like soft and mellow music to this very cinematic music. He goes from being similarly passive, following the rules of the police and whatnot, to in that split second sliding the clip out, opening his handcuffs, and it's just bedlam in a matter of seconds. So there's this scene with the elevator where it's like this analog thing. I don't even know what you would call it, but the hand pointing thing that indicates the floors, right? You might not notice it, but they notice it climbing up, right? Where the elevator goes up to the floor where he's being held, and it ever so slowly starts coming back down and stopping on 3. And it's like just these little things that add tension. In the hands of some other people, you would have maybe just had it like Hannibal like gets free from the handcuffs, but he grabbed someone's gun and, shot his way out and blah, 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 like a guns blazing kind of situation. But here you have it where it's subtle. Which it makes it even more impactful. It adds to the drama. It adds to the intensity. Here's all these police officers here for just this one man. And you see it's warranted because of the destruction that he causes, right? He wreaks undeniable havoc in seemingly no time. So they rush into the room where he was previously being held. He's obviously now out of his cell. And here's this guy he's taken and suspended from the cage in what's usually in an angelic pose. But here it's incredibly gory and gruesome. It's taken this like traditional image and turning it on its head. If you think about it, Buffalo Bill has obvious issues and is a violent individual. Yet while we see the aftermath of his crimes, we as the audience don't witness him in the act of killing anyone. Meanwhile, Lecter seems to be this incredibly calm, cultured, and debonair man. He seems harmless for much of the movie. But when he shows that other side, it's absolute mayhem. The movie kind of flips expectations as far as what a killer's supposed to look like. You have seemingly the 2 officers in the room where Hannibal was being held, with one being obviously dead, the other seriously injured but alive. So they load up the survivor on the stretcher, and as they go to do a more thorough assessment, he begins to shake as though he's in shock, which then leads to him being rushed onto the elevator so they can get him to a hospital quickly. And with this, there's now a moment of calm as they're riding down in the elevator. But the tension ratchets up as, once again, drops of liquid, which turn out to be blood, fall from above and land on the white sheet covering the stretcher. Having the officers notice the drip and slowly looking up, only to see this pooling blood is terrifying. The elevator is full of people and seemingly one man on top of the elevator car, but he manages to terrify them all based on what he's done so far. The subtlety just adds to the terror. They get the stretcher out of the elevator and load it into the ambulance, but now have to deal with getting who they think is Lecter off the top of the elevator car without having anyone else die or be injured. The officers position themselves to pull the body down into the elevator, only to realize it's not Lecter. And then there's this dawning reality that they've helped this incredibly dangerous man escape. You ask the question of, well, where is he? And so in the moment when the police and the audience are thinking, where's Lecter? He sits up in the ambulance right next to the paramedic. He then takes off the police officer's face, which is figuratively and literally a mask that he's been wearing. He essentially makes a face mask for himself to escape. Sort of like Buffalo Bill, right? He's making this suit for himself out of the skins of these women that he's killing. And Lecter has killed 2 people and effectively taken one of their faces to hide himself, to provide a means for himself to escape. And so with this, we see just this tremendous act of violence. But up to this point, he's been somewhat docile, right? Disarmingly safe in appearance. But when we see him sit up next to this paramedic and reveal his true self, and at this point now, essentially being free, he's out of jail. At least at the moment, he's beyond the control of the police. And so there's this thing throughout the film about identity, right? With, like, you could say the three main characters, Hannibal Lecter and Buffalo Bill, where both of them kind of create these masks for themselves, right? In Buffalo Bill's case, he's creating this bodysuit. In Hannibal's case, he has this veneer of genteel, but like makes a human face mask for himself in order to escape. You also have that with Clarice as well, where this thing of trying to save the innocent goes back to, it's something that's still with her as an adult, but actually goes back to her childhood. And we see the danger she puts herself in, that she certainly has something to prove, that she wants, pretty much she broke out of this West Virginia community in search of something better for herself, for a better life for herself. As Lecter kind of deduces early on in the film, he picks up on it, this like accent that she's trying to hide. You know, she also has this image that she's trying to portray, this identity that she's wearing in interacting with other people, kind of hiding what she's come from, pushing towards creating this new life for herself, this new identity for herself. So it's like throughout the film, there's this underlying thing that you see between those three characters about identity. Now, granted, she's, you know, not like a serial killer, so she's different from Lecter and Buffalo Bill, but there's still this thing within her, just as it is with the other two characters, about identity. You even have that with Chilton as well, right? Where it's obvious that he wants attention, right? He's the director of this hospital for the criminally insane. But we see there's some indication from his interaction, from Starling's interactions with Hannibal Lecter, that like little bit of weirdness that you pick up on from him, he's not such a great guy or a nice person. You know, that he likely to some degree, if not abuses his power over Lecter, might possibly be harassing him as well. And we see like his somewhat inappropriate behavior when they're getting ready to transfer Lecter, you know, where it's like he's like hanging about in the area where Lecter is kept prisoner. And it's just like these little weird touches about him, where it's like a thing about identity with him as well. He's like this little man that has a sense of self-importance about himself, and uses his position to bring attention to himself, to make himself feel more important. We see that during his early interaction with Clarice, where he sees himself, or he sees this as an opportunity for him to join in and be a part of things, when she kind of brushes him off, and she has to kind of like clean up the situation a little bit by appealing to his ego. But it's just like this thing that we see throughout the film about identity, like how people see themselves versus how they present themselves. Not so much how people see themselves, who people are internally, their internal lives, and how they feel about themselves, versus who they are in reality, and then who they try to portray themselves as being. And so I like that aspect of the movie, you know, where it's like, sure, you have the surface level movie where it's Clarice trying to hunt down this killer, but then there's like this deeper thing of her exploring herself and trying to figure herself out, right? That she's having to give of herself, having to sacrifice of herself to try to solve this series of crimes. Like she's trying to get information from Lecter, sure, to gain a better understanding of Buffalo Bill so that she can track him down and find him. But at the same time, she also has to allow Lecter to delve into her mind, to like root around in her memories and things like that, in exchange for him to provide her with information. And so with that, it's like she ends up giving of herself and trying to track down this killer. So I actually enjoyed that. I like the different layers that you have within the movie. this, I really didn't want to do like a recap of the movie, so I've glossed over a lot of things, but really just wanted to touch on some of the major themes and some of the things that I found most interesting. So even towards the end of the film, where they've kind of figured out who Buffalo Bill is, right? Or they think they have. You have Crawford and the FBI, where they show up to one location, and then you have Clarice. On her own, she shows up to another location, right? Both of them think they figured out who Buffalo Bill is. And it turns out that Clarice Starling is actually right. The FBI, they've put together like a whole team and everything like that, but they actually go to the wrong location. Whereas you then have Clarice, who it puts her in immense danger because she is going to be coming into contact with this incredibly dangerous man, and she's dolo. She's by herself. It's like essentially she's working on behalf of the FBI, but in this moment, she doesn't have the backing. She doesn't have any support or backup, right? They're all at this other location. And so we see with her moving through Buffalo Bill's house and interacting with him, like the danger just ratchets up, you know, in that when she becomes convinced that she's in the right place, she realizes she's in the right place. He knows that she's an FBI agent. He kind of toys around with her and, you know, kind of plays coy and stuff like that and figuring out how much she really knows. But then there's like this moment where she's trying not to let on that she's realized that he's Buffalo Bill. And he's also trying to get information from her without revealing, if she doesn't know as yet, that he's the person she's looking for. And it's like this thing of them kind of dancing around each other, right? It goes back to this thing of identity throughout the film, of people being who they are, but then presenting a different face to others. And so it's just really interesting to see how that breaks down. And the danger that she ends up being in, right? We see some of the things from like her training and whatnot of early on in the film where she's going through this training exercise of clearing a room, right? Like as a practice run or a practice drill. And she misses, clearing like an area that's outside of her view, like properly scanning the room to make sure there's no danger there. But we see that come into play here where she comes into contact with Buffalo Bill. You know, ultimately here, she's grown enough over the course of the movie where she's able to rectify the situation and, you know, the movie ends as it ends. I think this is possibly one of the greatest movies ever. When I saw it years ago, I thought it was incredible then. And now, several years later, after having watched it, I don't know how many times, I still think it's a great movie. If you like thrillers, if you're into true crime, if you like police procedurals, slow burning films, I think this movie would be right up your alley. And that's if you haven't seen it as yet, because I believe it was like a really big movie when it came out. If you're squeamish, maybe not, because there is some gore. I don't think that the violence or gore are at the same level as your typical horror movie or slasher film. But for much of the movie, it's more of a slow burn. You do see some dead bodies given the nature of the film and that they're investigating murders, but it doesn't come across as a film where they're trying to shock or disgust the audience with over-the-top gore and violence. It's a part of the story and makes sense in the context of the story, but I don't feel like the violence or the blood in the movie was like overdone. Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist. Go ahead and click that thumbs up button if you like what you saw. Go ahead and share it on social media.